It is difficult enough to look at something that we don't understand and not have a certain emotional and intellectual reaction towards it. But sound, there is an undeniable immediacy to it. Whereas we can look away from a bright light, pull our hand away from a hot stove, or hold our noses when we smell something horrid, we can cover our ears to the best of our ability, but when the bang of an explosion hits us, we will feel it, no matter how hard we press on our ears. Sound invades, resonates, and lingers within us, leaving an imprint on both our senses and emotions. This becomes especially profound when encountering a sound that resists explanation. An anomaly, a distortion or a noise birthed from the unfamiliar. The exclusion zones in the Stalker media, be it the book by Strugatsky, the movie by Tarkovsky, or the game franchise, challenge us to confront such incomprehensible sounds. These zones are spaces of contradiction, where natural laws bend and break and the ordinary becomes uncanny. Here, sound plays a critical role. It doesn't merely accompany the visual surrealism, but becomes its own enigma, shaping our experience of these landscapes. So I asked myself this question: what would these zones sound like? To answer this is to explore the limits of perception, the physics of altered environments, and the emotional impact of sounds that evoke fear, wonder, and disorientation. With this project, I delve into the zone's auditory landscape, examining how physical anomalies might alter sound, how sonification helps us imagine the unseeable, and why these sonic spaces captivate our imagination. I also want to analyze the games and the movie and see how they approach the sound of the zone. Maybe they have some answers for our question.
Puzzling reports of heat.
Welcome to the zone, an area cut off from civilization, left to vegetate and corrode in its own rubble. There are real-life exclusion zones like the Chernobyl exclusion zone, which was created after the 1986 nuclear disaster. But the zone, or better, zones, that we are dealing with are fundamentally different. These are enigmatic places with shifting rules and phenomena, physical occurrences and distortions that make no sense based on our scientific knowledge. Right now, we are looking at the zone from the game franchise Stalker, though the name encapsulates two other varying zones. The one from the book Roadside Picnic by the Strugatskys, and the one from the movie Stalker by Tarkovsky. In the novel, the zone is the result of an alien visitation, a kind of cosmic roadside picnic, where extraterrestrials left behind strange artifacts, radiation, and other anomalies. The film by Tarkovsky retains the concept of the zone as a perilous, otherworldly space, but removes explicit references to aliens or any clear origin, and instead renders the zone as a metaphysical reflection of the character's inner world. The Stalker games explicitly set their zone in a fictionalized version of the Chernobyl exclusion zone following the 1986 disaster. Unlike Tarkovsky's zone, which is metaphysical, and the novel's zone, which is alien in origin, the game's zone emerges as the result of a series of fictional scientific experiments gone wrong, including the infamous second explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. These experiments created phenomena of varying physical nature, like radiation, heat, and gravity. Later, we will go into greater detail regarding the properties of the different zones, for these will be relevant for our main question regarding their sound design. We are standing in front of a phenomenon that is not scientifically explainable. An anomaly. This anomaly defies our physical knowledge and is therefore, first and foremost, a concept of fiction, an imagined breach of natural law. Let's use this case as an example for our former posed question. What would it sound like? The answer can only be suggestive, of course. We have to remind ourselves these are sonic mysteries. Though science and the physics of sound could give us hints on how to actually approach this. Therefore, if we want to dive into this thought experiment, we have to differentiate between fact and interpretation. Where do we leave the realm of physics and start to interpret? And with what intention? After all, there's also the commercial aspect. What do people actually want to hear? Maybe reality is underwhelming, or maybe it is not graspable. All this is very theoretical, so let's use this anomaly as an example. Firstly, what do we see that could generate sound? There's flying rocks that are somehow elevated from the ground and pushed to the vertex of the anomaly. There are multiple energy fields that seem to warp light and space. There's also ambient sound, rain, winds, and maybe a kind of rustling from the ruin. Now, the ambient sounds are no problem. We all know what rain sounds like after all. The flying rocks could make a sound by hitting each other. They don't hover with a lot of speed, except at the vertex, so maybe they would generate some kind of faint rumbling or rustling sound, created by smaller and bigger rocks, occasionally and randomly hitting each other at various speeds. Where it gets complicated are the multiple energy fields we see at the bottom of the anomaly and the fields letting the debris levitate. We can clearly see that in this anomaly there's some kind of gravitational distortion going on. When one walks into one of these energy fields, one gets sucked in, like in a black hole. Now, strictly speaking, energy itself doesn't emit sound. Thunder only creates its characteristic clap because of the energy rapidly heating up the surrounding air, resulting in its expansion and the creation of a shockwave. High voltage lines only hum or buzz because of ionizing air, where air molecules lose or gain electrons, turning them into charged particles called ions. These moving particles can create faint humming or buzzing sounds by colliding with other particles, which in return emits energy that results in similar yet smaller shockwaves like we had with the thunder. Contrary to thunder, high voltage lines release much smaller amounts of energy over time, creating the continuous buzzing or humming sound. Now, dependent on the type of energy fields that we are dealing with here, those fields could generate a similar buzzing sound. Let's listen to it. The game developers offer us a pretty similar sound. Listen to the original sound. Alright, so I think there's more potential here. So let's do a thought experiment. Let's say that those fields wouldn't ionize air, and would hypothetically only be of gravitational nature and only change the density of air. Sound waves could theoretically bend or refract, because they travel faster or slower in lighter and denser air. Look at the findings of the study on acoustic properties of sound waves propagated by jets. We are looking at the jet's flow field. The green yellowish lines are sound waves that display two distinct patterns, directional and omnidirectional, meaning a somewhat linear and circular propagation of sound waves. Those different patterns partly illustrate that sound waves interact with regions of varying density, in this case caused by shock waves and turbulences. Now, we have our gravity patches with probably denser fluctuating air in it. Look at how it is randomly changing towards the center and pulsating towards its outer layers. The speed of the sound waves could alter randomly. Now, if this effect is strong enough, a sound could reverberate in more complex ways and mess with our ability to place sounds spatially. Here's an example. It is a subtle effect, but we could also take it to extremes. This is all very hypothetical, of course, for the structure doesn't even have a roof and the sound would be lost in the open space and not reverberate as much as it did in this example. Therefore, the effect would be less audible. It is interesting to think about the ways physical parameters could affect sound waves and how the unpredictability of these parameters within anomalies affects the things we hear. I think that this is the point at which interpretation plays a role. It is a space that we don't understand, after all, with rules that we don't know. So, before we continue to take a closer look at the different sound designs of the different Stalker iterations, there are two more things I want to address that could be interesting in the context of anomalies. First off, what about radiation? Chernobyl is an irradiated zone, after all, so what influence could that have? One of the characteristics and dangers of radiation is that it is a silent killer. You don't hear and you don't see radiation, and the effects of radiation mostly surface after exposure, dependent on the dose, of course. That is why, in various radioactive hazards during the past, people weren't even conscious of the dangers they were in. The only indication of your body receiving a dose of radiation, again dependent on the dose, is either a strange metallic taste in your mouth, caused by radiation both directly damaging your taste buds and interacting with your saliva, or vomiting and nausea, though at this point it is probably already too late. Interference with electronic equipment can result in some visual changes and maybe the equipment malfunctioning. The typical clicking that we hear in movies actually comes from a Geiger decimeter, a measuring device used to measure radiation. This distinct sound is created by radiation particles igniting a spark within a gas tube, which is situated within the decimeter. So it's not the actual sound of radiation, but the sound of a reaction caused within the decimeter. Now, there is a way to make the unhearable hearable. Listen to this recording of a pulsating neutron star. You might ask yourself how it is possible to capture the sound of something that is thousands of light years away, where the space between that object and us is a mere vacuum through which sound should not be able to travel. Well, the answer is, it doesn't. What you are hearing is the transformation of data and radio waves into sound. I built a small patch in Pure Data, a sound creation software, and tried to recreate the pulsar sound. In order to achieve this, I used a phaser or a phase ramp generator. I'm not going into great detail of how it works, but all you need to know is that it generates a click in a certain given frequency. The higher the number, the faster the click. If it gets really fast, we start to hear a tone. So if we enter the frequency of the pulsar, which is 174, we get the same tone that we listened to earlier. Sonification helps us to perceive data in a different way and make things audible that we otherwise couldn't hear. Does the neutron star actually sound like that? No. But if we are dealing with things that we can't sense audibly, sonification might be a tool to produce a sound that we can then work with and implement into a soundscape. In the Stalker media, visitors of the zone always seem to enter its premises through a violent and adventurous ride, undertaking dangerous maneuvers to get past border patrols and anomalous weather. This is true for the movie as well as for the game franchise. In Stalker 2, you are then met with a breathtaking anomaly, towering over the walls like a warning sign saying, "Your rules don't matter here." To our surprise, the zone seems to quiet down after the explosive introductory act. A long stretched ride on a trolley, rustling grass and inhabitants of the zone going about their business. No matter how mind-bending, dangerous and hostile an environment might be, when faced with those dangers over a prolonged period of time, we seem to adapt and always try to make the best of it. Get some kind of routine going and fill the hostile space with individual spaces of safety and familiarity. All of this seems almost normal. This is the point at which Stalker 2 takes a different approach than its predecessors. The Ambience Sound design is realistic, familiar and could be applied to any other area of the world that is not plagued by the zone's influence. There are no strangely reverberating sounds, No weird mutant cries and no underlying hums, whispers or other anomalous sounds that could break the illusion of a normal Sunday evening. In Stalker 2, the zone can be a beautiful place, with all its strange and uncanny properties that we might find if we look closer. With the older Stalker games, the approach to sound design is slightly different. There are also moments of calm, familiarity and safety, though traversing the zone feels threatening, with cries of mutants, gunshots, and strange whispers lingering in the distance. The sound design of the older Stalker games feels less realistic and familiar, but it almost takes on a symbolic quality with its blatantly violent sounds that invade the player's space.
Иди ко мне. Ты обретешь то, что заслуживаешь.
This is not a safe place, and there's nothing normal about it. Just compare the frequently occurring emissions between the two games and notice how rigorously more direct and violent the older games handled them, especially with mods. It seems to me that Stalker 2 seems to approach the sound design from a more realistic and maybe safer point of view, aiming for a more pleasant and beautiful experience, working with sounds that are relatable, straightforward and more nuanced. Whereas the older games seem to immerse their acoustic world building in dread and a more rough package of dense sounds and occurrences that portray their meaning in a more direct way. To me, both variants are interesting, heightening different qualities and achieving immersion in different ways. Sometimes Stalker 2's approach feels a bit too timid for my taste and causes me to look back at the older games seeking the feeling of dread that I had when I entered the reactor for the first time. And then again, I listened to the satisfying gun sounds of the newest game and the beautiful rendition of the complex sounds of anomalies and remember why the older games had such a huge modding community, refining the game's experience with great care. Still, when I think about the lore of the game franchise, I can't help but compliment the older game's approach.
Hello?
Remember when I called the game franchise's zone to be a mix of the book and the movie? You see, as I mentioned before, the zone of the games is a result of failed experiments conducted near the Chernobyl power plant, a place that was chosen because of its lower population and less interference with the outside world. A calm and quiet place where a sketchy group of scientists called the Sea Consciousness could conduct their studies at peace. All this started in 1989 and resulted in a vast network of laboratories being deployed within the exclusion zone, called the X Labs. The research mostly focused on mind control. The ultimate goal was to create a global noosphere, a concept borrowed from real-world philosophy created by Vladimir Vernadsky, where human consciousness could be unified and elevated to a higher state. In the game, this theoretical concept was brought to reality in the form of a sphere surrounding the Earth, encompassing all human conscious thought and intellectual activity. The Sea Consciousness aimed to alter or control the noosphere to influence reality itself. The idea was that by reshaping collective consciousness, they could effectively reprogram humanity and the world. They experimented on mind control, genetic mutations, and psychic energy. During one of these experiments, a catastrophic accident occurred, referred to as the second explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. This explosion released massive amounts of psychic and anomalous energy, transforming the Chernobyl exclusion zone into the strange and deadly zone of the games. The emissions that the player regularly experiences in the game are like aftershocks of that second explosion. A result of the instability of the zone, releasing energy like a balloon that pops. Though the second explosion was probably way bigger in scale, an expansion of energy so big that it throws dimensions together like scrambled eggs. Now, the hauntingly bizarre soundscape of the older games makes more sense when you think of it. A blend of real sound and audible hallucinations, sound artifacts conjured up by the noosphere dimension, colliding and breaking into our three-dimensional world. Auditory sensation is raised to a new level, where consciousness and processing of sound plays a role too. Now we not only have to ask ourselves what the real thing will sound like, but how and what information enters our brain. The possibilities of sound and auditory occurrences become endless, making it impossible to foresee what traversing such a landscape would actually sound like. Anything could happen. Maybe the whisper you just heard is a bandit hiding in a hole, or maybe it is your mind playing tricks on you, or a controlled occurrence that is supposed to lure you into a trap. What is that humming sound? Is it coming from the ground? Pipes? Maybe an earthquake? Or maybe it is just in your head, an auditory experience taking on schizophrenic properties. Let's take a step back and ground ourselves. Didn't the movie have a metaphysical approach too? There's a great paper by Stefan Smith called The Edge of Perception, Sound in Tarkovsky's Stalker, that explores the movie's sound design in great detail. To further understand the approach of Tarkovsky and his composer Eduard Artemiev, who also composed the music for Solaris and Mirror, we should understand a few key concepts. Diegetic and non-diegetic sound. Diegetic sound is any sound that emanates from the story world of the film, like characters' dialogue, object sounds, and ambient sounds. Non-diegetic sound is any sound that does not originate from within the film's world, like score, narration, or voiceover. Until this point, we only talked about diegetic sound. Now, sorry if I butchered his name, but Michel Chion references ideas of Pierre Schaeffer's musique concrète. That's a little French. A musical concept and philosophy of the 20th century aiming to diverge from traditional music by focusing on real-life sounds and their sound properties. In musique concrète, sounds are isolated from their natural occurrences in order to explore their musical potential, regardless of their original source. In order to achieve this, Schaeffer isolated train sounds and looped them independently in his piece Etude au chemin de fer. People have been discussing whether or not Schaeffer was successful with this experiment, stating that associations will always be a part of our listening experience, and we will always hear trains and not independent sound occurrences. So, Michel Chion references these ideas and differentiates between two ways of listening: casual listening and reduced listening. Casual listening means to listen to a sound in order to gain information about its cause and/or source. Reduced listening means to focus on the traits of the sound itself, independent of its cause and meaning. Normally, we listen casually, associating sounds with its source. The chirping of a bird is the source of a chirping bird, and the clap of a thunder is the clap of a thunder. We always reference sounds based on their source and label them accordingly. That is why we have the ability to hear, in order to orient ourselves and to be able to differentiate between a sound that could be dangerous, like the roaring of a tiger for example, and a sound that possesses no threat, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. Sound, therefore, represents its source, but not in Tarkovsky's Stalker. Let's remind ourselves, Tarkovsky's zone is a metaphysical concept, a representation of the inner world of our protagonist. Let's take the infamous trolley scene as an example. The journey to the zone begins on a motorized handcar, a simple trolley. But instead of focusing on the train itself, the scene draws us into the faces of the three main characters. The only accompaniment is the rhythmic hissing and clanging of the handcar off the tracks. Interestingly, in this scene, apart from the initial boarding, the train itself is never shown again. Its presence is felt entirely through sound. This absence of visuals shifts our attention inward. The physical journey fades into the background, transforming into an introspective, emotional passage. The sound design plays a critical role here. The initial clanking ties us to casual listening. We instinctively associate the sound with its source. But as the scene progresses, the sound evolves. Ambient noise is stripped away, and the clanking becomes less natural, slightly manipulated with electronic treatment. Echoes stretch and morph the sound, blurring the line between reality and perception. This progression draws us deeper into the inner worlds of the characters. The hypnotic, ever-changing soundscape detaches from its physical source, pulling us into the zone quite literally. Here, the journey isn't just external, it's a passage between reality and inner experience. The lines between diegetic sound, so the sound that occurs within the film, and non-diegetic sound, the sound that is only audible to the viewer, blend. The blending of sound dimensions shows us that the focus lies on the individual who creates the reality. Reality is not a predefined set of values and rules that can be applied collectively, but is constantly shifting and blurring. When the characters enter the zone, the film shifts from black and white to color, revealing a seemingly familiar landscape of meadows, trees, and a distant river, just like in Stalker 2. Yet, the near absence of sound creates an unsettling otherworldly atmosphere. Tarkovsky doesn't use pure silence, but instead amplifies isolated sounds, according to the rules of musique concrète. At times, ambient noises like wind emerge unexpectedly, or a strange creak or cry cuts through the stillness, mirroring the growing unease of the characters as they journey deeper into the zone. That is also the difference to musique concrète. While musique concrète aims to only look at the sound and its properties, Tarkovsky uses isolated sound to evoke emotion. Take the scene as an example. Sound becomes the consciousness of space. Subtle electronic pulses and drones merge with the natural environment, intensifying as the characters exit the frame. The wind grows louder, and the electronic tones shift into faint, discordant choral vocals, like distant memories of past events. Unseen and abstract, this sound invites reduced listening, functioning as an elusive score while remaining a natural extension of the space. Or this scene, where the sound follows our protagonists while the camera is positioned at an entirely different spot.
Смотрите, что это? Откуда? Я же вам объяснял. Что объяснял? Это зона, понимаете? Зона. Идемте скорее. Здесь. Идемте.
During this scene, the zone shifts and leads the characters back to an earlier point of their journey. The juxtaposition of sound symbolizes their disorientation and simultaneously resembles the shift within the zone's structure. While watching the movie, I always seem to notice the sound as something that doesn't quite fit the picture and the scene, like a badly edited sound design. Though Tarkovsky does this on purpose, as he expressed in the following quote. In itself, accurately recorded sound adds nothing to the image system of cinema, for it still has no aesthetic content. As soon as the sounds of the visible world are removed from it, or that world is filled, for the sake of the image, with extraneous sounds that don't exist literally, or if the real sounds are distorted so that they no longer correspond with the image, then the film acquires a resonance.
заставить человека испытывать чувства, внушенные.
Throughout this exploration, we delved into the intricate soundscapes of exclusion zones as portrayed across the Stalker media. Each medium presents the zone differently based on interpretation and concept. Be it a more blatantly violent soundscape designed to evoke dread, a more realistic approach, or a more metaphysical approach. Yet all share a common thread: the use of sound to deepen the enigma of these spaces. We began by examining the unique challenges of capturing the sounds of the incomprehensible, where sonification might be an answer. Physical anomalies like gravitational distortions or energy fields may alter sound in ways that defy our perceptions, resulting in effects such as refracted sound waves or disorienting reverberations. We then looked at the juxtaposition of ambient tranquility and invasive soundscape within the Stalker games, which immerse us in the surreal and hostile environments of the zone in contrary but effective ways. Stalker 2 invites us to explore a more subdued yet intricately realistic rendition of the zone, offering a sensory experience grounded in nuanced soundscapes that emphasize beauty and relatability, all the while hiding its horrors beneath a layer of normalcy. Its predecessors, however, used a haunting, symbolic, and often brutal auditory world, which immersed players in an atmosphere of dread and disorientation, befitting the zone's fractured, surreal nature. Then we turned to Tarkovsky's film, where sound transcends its diegetic origins to serve as a psychological and metaphysical element. By blurring the line between real and imagined sounds, Tarkovsky emphasizes the zone as an introspective space, a manifestation of the character's inner worlds. This interplay between diegetic and non-diegetic sound challenges viewers to perceive beyond the physical, inviting reduced listening to focus on the essence of sound itself. The soundscape of the zone, whether in games or cinema, is not merely a backdrop, but an extension of its mysteries. From the eerie whispers of the older Stalker games to the restrained realism of the latest installment, each interpretation challenges us to confront the unknown in unique ways. Sound becomes more than sensation. It transforms into storytelling, a bridge between the physical and the metaphysical. Sound, ultimately, is a narrative device. As we venture deeper into these spaces, real or imagined, we are reminded that sound shapes our perception of reality. It tells us what we cannot see, invites us to feel what we cannot touch, and pushes us to question what we think we know. The zone's auditory landscape mirrors its existential paradox: a world of incomprehensible laws, chaotic beauty, and unrelenting dread. Ultimately, capturing the sound of the zone is less about perfect replication and more about interpretation. A creative act that invites us to explore the boundary between what is real and what is possible. In this space, sound resonates not just in our ears, but within our minds, forever altering the way we perceive the world. Now, what would the zone sound like? I'd like to think that it